Really?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Brilliant.
Cool. So you're involved with Band Aid 20. Sorry to repeat some of the questions that you've already answered, but can you just tell us about how you got involved and what to expect?
Well, we had a call a few weeks ago saying that they're pulling it together, and it was surprising. Bolt from the blue, I had no idea that they were doing it, but from what I can gather, the situation there is worse than it was at the time they did it the first time round, but awareness of it seems to be at an all-time low. So this is obviously as significant as the last one, and I hope it will have as big an impact as it did before. You know, it's an important song for a kick-off, just on a musical level, and you know what it's there to do is. You know, it's a really special project, and we're very honoured to be involved in it.
And a second chance at getting another a Christmas #1.
That's not a concern of mine at all, to be honest. You know, I don't care whether it comes in at the top 30 as long as it's. You know, I'm looking forward to the day itself and meeting everyone and joining in.
The original was just it was such a classic. There must be some sort of pressure on everybody that's making it not to.
Yeah, so I think I love the original recording. I think it's a brilliant moment, really, but. I don't know, there'll be something about this one. There's a good vibe about it so far. So.
Excellent. Well, I hope it goes well for you.
Thanks very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. Would you please welcome broadcaster and all-round news chap, Michael Burke.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. 20 years ago, give or take a couple of days, I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning while it was still dark in a mud room in a small town, a village really, in northern Ethiopia. It was called Korum. And with a couple of friends and colleagues, the cameraman Mohammed Amin and my BBC radio colleague Mike Wooldridge, we drove out of Korum on the road and turned left on a dirt track to a plain that stretched north of Korum to the distant mountains. All along that road, in the dark, but picked out by the headlights, were destitute and desperate people. And the headlights produced a whole series of snapshots. A woman crying over a bundle, I assume a dead child, and the headlights caught her crying, her tears, as she kind of rocked back and forward. An old man squatting on top of obviously uncontrollable diarrhea. An old woman who threw herself right in front of the vehicle, and I thought was trying to kill herself. But in actual fact, we subsequently found out that the old people in Ethiopia, in their extreme distress at that time, actually thought they had the devil physically on their backs. And she was actually trying to get us to the vehicle to knock the devil off. When we got to this great field, this plain, it was still dark. But you had a sense of a great mass of humanity there. You could hear a lot of snuffling, a lot of grunting, groaning, crying, wailing indeed. But all you could see, because they wear these sort of rather pale robes, which struck me very forcibly as being like the illustrations in my Bible when I was at school. All you could see with all these light-coloured robes was this light colour spreading over the dark of the plain, rather as if it was like dirty snow. When day broke, it was like pulling a curtain across on what must have been at least one of, if not the biggest human catastrophe of the 20th century. On that field were something over 40,000 people who'd come there in absolute desperation, looking for help that hadn't come. And they were just dying, and where they had no cover, they had no or very little food, practically no food, and they were just dying in the cold of the night mainly. It's a dreadful thing to watch somebody actually dying of starvation. What actually happens is that the body kind of eats itself from the inside, eats itself inside out. And those people, and there were a lot of them, children and old people mainly, who were dying of pneumonia and the diseases that prey on the starving, were actually the lucky ones. A lot of people died during that night, and as soon as dawn came, they were dragged out of the camp and laid out in rows in front of us, or where we happened to be. There were an awful lot of them. There were dozens of people who died every night. I think at one stage it got to over 100 a night. And that sense of incredible stoicism and dignity that Ethiopian people have broke down at that particular point, and the grief was just completely uncontrollable. It's very difficult to explain what it's like to be in that kind of situation, because it was quite literally stunning. Your feelings, your senses, your emotions are all stunned. And you think to yourself, how are you possibly going to be able to convey all this to people who are going to look at it in the safety and comfort of their sitting rooms on a two-dimensional box in the corner of their rooms? How can you possibly convey to them anything about what that's like? They are there thinking, shall I go for a pee, have a cup of tea or something like that? They're not there, they're not seeing it, they're not smelling it, they're not having desperate mothers trying to give you their babies or things of that nature. I wanted very much for people not just to know what the story was, that combination of drought and war and outright evil and actually worldwide neglect. I didn't only want that, but I wanted people to feel two other things. I wanted people to feel the sense of anger that I felt, and I wanted people also to feel the sense of inadequacy that I felt. I felt totally inadequate in those circumstances. Journalism anyway is a predatory business. And particularly if you're an African correspondent, even for an organization with the purposes that the BBC has, human suffering is your raw material. And you don't have a very high sense of self-worth, as if it mattered, when you're in that situation and you have no skills and no resources with which to help the people in front of you. I had no great expectations. I hoped people would take notice. I hoped people would care. I did not think at that stage that people should feel not just a sense of personal responsibility, but also a sense that they could actually do something about it, a sense of responsibility and a sense of empowerment. I think one person above all others are responsible for that. To my mind, that empowering people and getting people to feel involved, of somehow contributing to that arc of empathy that linked the first world and the third world in its distress, at that particular moment, at that particular time, never happened before, and to some extent never happened again. One person, I think, was responsible for that more than any other, and I think that in a way is more important even than Live Aid. Greatest concert in the world though it ever was, greatest shared experience in mankind's history though it was. I think that connecting of the first world and the third world is the responsibility of one man in particular. Ladies and gentlemen, 20 years on, where I have to say, although a lot of lives were saved, money was raised, consciousness raised, an awful lot of good was done, but the underlying problems have not been solved. 20 years on, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Geldof.
Thank you. 20 years on and not a day older. Poor Michael. He always has to introduce me and I him. We've lived our lives for the last 20 years in constant reference to each other, but it's very weird to meet up with someone who is personally responsible for a complete different path taken in your life. He did it that October evening in 1984, and that which is now considered one of the greatest news reports in the 20th century, all of us watched, or most of us of my generation saw and felt a sense of impotence that, as he said, nothing could be done. And 20 years after going to Africa many times, which some of us in this room have done, it's still the images of Michael's report that remain vividly with me and move me emotionally. I remember about 6 months ago, Pete Townsend saying to Michael Moore, "You'll have to convince me that a man with a camera is more powerful than a man with a guitar." And guess who just won the last US election? And what effect did Live Aid have? A couple of geezers with guitars and a clutch of songs and a handful of Band-Aids. And it did change the world. Grandiose as that sounds, when Michael showed us what was happening, we responded in the only way we could as singers and songwriters and players. And what none of us anticipated is what you're about to see. The promise of all those pop singers before Live Aid, that, you know, the times they are changing and all you need is love and there's nothing that you do that can't be done, actually came true on that day. And friends of mine who played on that day and who are here tonight will talk about that as almost a unique point of their musical lives or their personal lives. Something else happened, and that for many of the artists, I mean, I saw it, they came off stage and were kind of going, what was that? Where did they go to when they were playing? They sort of elevated themselves into something beyond that which they ever thought possible. The impact of Live Aid was twofold. Initially, of course, it was to try and prevent as many people from dying in the way that Michael has just described. And the second thing was to talk to the planet about a problem so monstrous that all humanity would be affected by the potential death of 30 million people through hunger in a world of surplus. That not only is intellectually absurd, it is morally repulsive. And we talked to the world, because that was for the first time possible with all these satellites, in the lingua franca of the planet, which is not English, it's pop music. And the electronic hearth of the planet was television. Now, none of us considered that to be the case, but that's what happened. And the immediate political effect was immense. Once I'd realized the number of people who watched this event, I got on a plane and went around to the various capitals, and we were able to, in effect, double the amount of money that had been made possible through people's donations, and this time through direct political action. We also changed, I think, something like 36 laws, or were influential and changed them, governing the behavior of the first world towards the third. And finally, the UN, for the first time in its history, debated Africa in 1986. I returned from Africa yesterday. In the 20 years since this concert, Africa has been the sole continent in inexorable economic decline. More people die of hunger in Africa than war, AIDS, TB, malaria, and polio combined every year. It is a commonplace for the majority of Africans to feel hungry. A commonplace. If you pass in the car simply because you're white, they'll go like this, you know, or this. After 3 days, you actually don't see it. That's why this comes out. We could put a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, but the gaping wound is political. We can't do that. We play guitars, we write songs, a lot of you sell that. 20 years on, I promised the people in this room and who played on that day, who aren't here tonight, that it would be one-off, no films, no records, no videos. There was no DVD then. And because of the bootleggers, the pirates selling this on eBay, I know it's corny and St. Bobbish, but what they're doing is literally taking whatever food is available out of the mouths of the hungry, whatever hypodermics they can get out of the arms of the sick. These fucking pukes had to be stopped. So that was the initial imperative for the release of the DVD. Immediately, all the artists, in fact, said yes, except for a couple, and they just felt their performance was so shite they just couldn't face it, you know. But generally, those who even were shite said, "Yeah, okay, fuck it, we were shit," you know. So that came first. The second and profoundly important thing, besides the money raised for this, is that this fires the starting pistol for the vital political year of 2005. Why? Britain is chair of the G8 and president of the EU. The 7 richest countries in the planet are coming to this country to meet and debate. Now, Live Aid took an issue nowhere on the political agenda and put it at the top. But in the 20 years it's been since then, it's taken that time to take it from an issue of charity to one of justice. Next year, Britain must demand that the agenda that this generation put on the top table of politics is finally met. And the Prime Minister of this country has a unique responsibility as a member of the Live Aid generation to deliver exactly that agenda. Once this had been decided to happen, a bizarre series of coincidences took place, and this is a very Live Aid thing. I mean, Midge will tell you that weird things happen. I was in Addis a few weeks ago with the Prime Minister, and the Sun had organised that little baby that's in the famous Cars video, Drive. And they'd found her, and she was studying to be an agriculturalist out in the country. And they brought her down to meet Blair. And he was taken aback and very affected by this, the reality of Live Aid, what it actually did. I've met an Oxford philosopher, Don, who was kept alive by Live Aid. I've met a national sporting champion who would have been dead had it not been for the fact that these guys played their tunes that day. I've met this agriculturalist. It's weird. It's really weird to meet a generation who would otherwise be dead. The Sun had organised this thing, and the next day they said, if we pushed for a second Band-Aid, would you do it? And once again, I called one of my most reliable friends, and the one I called first back in the 80s, and that was Midge. And I said, what do you think? And he said, oh, fuck off. and I said, yeah, but after fucking off, what do you think, you know? And I called Chris Martin from Coldplay. And Chris had spoke to me a couple of months ago. He said, look, man, anything I can do to help. Well, the time came to make the call. And Chris said yes, and Coldplay are a great band and very cool and completely contemporary. And so the ball started rolling again. Next Saturday, Band-Aid 20 happens with the cream of the rock and the pop people of this country again. And not only does Live Aid fire the starting pistol for the political year 2005, tonight and next Saturday, us lot, growing greyer, pass on that torch to another generation who have willingly picked it up. And that, once again, becomes not a political vote, it becomes a political demand that this ridiculous nonsense that I've spent the last 6 weeks trawling through finally gets dealt with. That this generation and the past 3 in Britain just will not have this crap any longer. And tonight, it's once more unto the breach dear friends. Not for St. George in England this time, but in this context, that's fine. It's once more unto the breach for the wretched, the mute, the weak, the tired, the beaten down and the put upon. It's once more unto the breach for the hungry. That was Live Aid, and still today, this is Live Aid.